November 16, 1632. The fog-choked fields of Lützen, Saxony. When Swedish cavalry officer Jakob Stalhansky rode out to retrieve his fallen king's body from the battlefield, he counted the wounds. 11 musket balls had torn through the massive warhorse beneath Gustavus Adolphus. The animal had carried Sweden's Lion of the North through cannon fire, through pike walls, through the very mouth of hell itself, running on nothing but dying momentum and battle fury. But it wasn't just the king's horse. Across those blood-soaked fields, Swedish cavalry mounts lay in twisted heaps, their bodies riddled with lead, their eyes still fixed forward in eternal charge. Horses that should have fallen after the first shot. Horses that had galloped through artillery barrages that would stop a modern tank. The Imperial gunners would later testify to something that haunted them until their dying days. The Swedish horses never screamed. Even as cannonballs tore through their ranks, even as grape shot shredded flesh from bone, they charged in absolute silence. But the truth was far more terrifying than simple courage or training. What drove those animals forward that day wasn't loyalty or discipline. It was something that military historians have tried to bury for nearly 4 centuries. Something that, once you understand it, changes everything you know about the 30 Years' War before we uncover the truth about the Swedish cavalry at Lützen. How 632 Protestant horses charged through fog into cannons, and why King Gustavus Adolphus's mount took 11 bullets before falling. Make sure to subscribe to Fierce Sermon and ring that notification bell. We're diving deep into one of history's most disturbing military mysteries, and you won't want to miss what we've uncovered. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers. Now let's discover what really happened on those fog-shrouded fields outside Lützen. The year 1632 sits at the blood-soaked heart of the 30 Years' War, a conflict so devastating that it would depopulate entire regions of Central Europe by 40%. This wasn't war as we understand it today. This was apocalypse rendered in steel and gunpowder, where armies consumed the countryside like locusts, where plague followed marching columns like a faithful dog, where the rules of civilization had simply ceased to apply. Sweden, under King Gustavus II Adolphus, had transformed from a peripheral Baltic power into Protestant Europe's great hope. The king himself was a military genius, a man who revolutionized warfare with mobile artillery, combined arms tactics, and a disciplinary system that turned Swedish conscripts into something approaching a professional army. He was 37 years old in 1632, at the absolute height of his powers, and he had never lost a major engagement. But Gustavus Adolphus possessed another quality that his contemporaries noted with a mixture of awe and unease. He was obsessed with his horses. The Swedish cavalry wasn't just trained, it was forged through a system that bordered on the occult. Contemporary accounts describe training grounds in Sweden where horses underwent conditioning that lasted up to 3 years. They were exposed to cannon fire while still colts. They were taught to charge toward noise rather than away from it. Drums, trumpets, musket volleys. Every sound of battle became a signal to advance rather than flee. But there was something else, something that Swedish cavalry officers rarely discussed outside their own ranks. The horses were fed a special mixture before battle. Archive records from the Swedish Military Commission of 1631 list procurement of massive quantities of aquavit, Swedish grain alcohol, along with something described only as Lapland herbs and preparations from the northern shamans. The Sami people of northern Scandinavia, practitioners of the old animistic faiths that predated Christianity, had apparently contributed something to Swedish military might. Pastor Johannes Mattias, who served as field chaplain with Swedish forces, wrote in his private journal, "The horses drink deep before battle. What they drink, I dare not record. The officers assure me it is necessary. I have prayed over this matter and received no answer from God." By November 1632, Gustavus Adolphus had been campaigning in Germany for 2 years. He'd won stunning victories at Breitenfeld and along the Lech River. He'd driven the Catholic imperial forces before him like chaff. But now, Imperial Generalissimo Albrecht von Wallenstein, a brilliant, ruthless commander who some said had sold his soul to dark powers for military knowledge, had assembled a massive force near the town of Lützen. Gustavus had to attack. Winter was coming. His supply lines were stretched. The German Protestant princes who supported him were wavering. Everything, the entire Protestant cause in Germany, perhaps the future of religious freedom in Europe, hung on one more victory. The morning of November 16th dawned with fog so thick that soldiers couldn't see 20 paces ahead. This was the kind of fog that 17th century armies feared. It made formations impossible to maintain, turned battlefields into chaos, gave every advantage to whoever happened to make contact first. The Swedish army numbered about 19,000 men. The Imperial forces under Wallenstein had perhaps 16,000, but they held strong defensive positions behind earthworks and had emplaced their artillery on rising ground. Those guns, heavy cannons loaded with canister shot and iron balls, commanded the approaches to Imperial lines. Modern military historians estimate that 17th-century artillery could achieve a hit rate of about 30% at close range against massed cavalry. The Swedish horse would have to charge through approximately 400 yards of killing ground to reach Imperial positions. Mathematical models suggest they should have lost 70 to 80% of their numbers before making contact. They should have broken. Any rational creature would have broken. But something was very wrong with the Swedish cavalry horses that day. The first incident occurred during the pre-dawn preparation. Lieutenant Axel Leijonhufvud, commanding a company of Finnish cavalry, recorded in his battle report. At 4 o'clock in the morning, the grooms distributed the battle preparation to the horses. The animals consumed it eagerly, more eagerly than I have witnessed before. Within the quarter hour, a strange calm descended upon them. They ceased all fidgeting. They stood as though carved from stone, their eyes fixed forward, seeing something we could not see. What was this battle preparation? Swedish military supply records from the campaign show requisitions for massive quantities of specific materials in the weeks before Lützen. 300 gallons of aquavit, 50 pounds of something listed as Berserkergang root, a direct reference to the legendary Viking berserker warriors who fought in trance states. 20 pounds of dried Amanita muscaria mushrooms, the red-capped fungi used by Sami shamans for vision quests. And, most disturbing, something described as blood meal from Uppland. Uppland being the region of Sweden where ancient pagan sacrificial sites still dotted the landscape. The mixture was administered to horses, not men. But what it did to those animals violated every principle of veterinary science then and now. The second incident came as the fog began to lift around 11 a.m. The Imperial artillery had been emplaced on a slight ridge, commanding the flat approaches. As Swedish forces organized for their assault, Imperial gunners could see the cavalry formations materializing out of the mist like ghosts. An Imperial artillery battery wrote in his after-action report, "We fired ranging shots. The balls struck among the enemy horse, tearing through both mount and rider. Yet those beasts did not shy, did not rear, did not scatter as any natural creature would. They simply stood, and those that fell were stepped over by their fellows without reaction. I felt in that moment that we faced something unholy. The Swedish cavalry waited. King Gustavus Adolphus, mounted on his favorite charger Streif, a massive gray destrier that stood 17 hands high, rode along the front ranks. Contemporary accounts note that the king seemed troubled. He conferred repeatedly with his cavalry commander, Field Marshal Gustaf Horn, and with his Finnish Lieutenant Colonel Torsten Stalhansky. What they discussed was never recorded officially, but a Finnish cavalry trooper named Matti Koskenkorva, who survived the battle, later testified before a Swedish military inquiry in 1635. His testimony was sealed and rediscovered only in 1987. The king was uncertain. He asked Colonel Stalhansky if the horses had been given the full preparation. The colonel assured him they had. "But can we control them?" the king asked. "Once they begin, can we pull them back?" The colonel said nothing. The king crossed himself then, which I had never seen him do before battle. "May God forgive us what we do this day," he said. The third incident occurred at approximately 1 p.m. when Gustavus Adolphus finally gave the order to charge. Swedish cavalry doctrine called for the caracole, a controlled advance where horsemen would trot forward, fire pistols, then wheel away to reload. It was measured, disciplined, designed to preserve force and maintain control. This is what the Imperial forces expected. It is not what happened. When the trumpets sounded, the Swedish cavalry went from standing still to full gallop in heartbeats. No trot, no canter. They exploded forward as though fired from cannon themselves. And they made no sound. This detail appears in virtually every Imperial account of the battle. The Swedish infantry were screaming war cries. The artillery was roaring. Muskets crackled along the line, but the cavalry, hundreds upon hundreds of horses thundering across the field, were absolutely silent. Imperial musketeer Karl Breitenfeld, positioned in earthworks directly in the cavalry's path, survived by throwing himself into a drainage ditch. His testimony to Imperial investigators, "They came like the wild hunt from old legends. I have been in 12 battles. I know what cavalry sounds like. Hoofbeats like drums, horses screaming, riders shouting. This was silent as death itself. I saw horses with their chests opened by cannonballs, running with their hearts visible, and they did not slow. I saw a ball take a horse's leg clean off at the knee, and it ran forward on the stump for 10 more paces before falling. They passed over me, and I swear before God and his saints that those horses' eyes were pure white. No pupil, no iris, just white. The Imperial artillery fired canister shot. Hundreds of musket balls packed into canisters that turned cannons into giant shotguns. At ranges of 50 to 100 yards, this was the most devastating anti-cavalry weapon available in the 17th century. It should have shredded the Swedish charge. The guns fired. Horses and men went down in bloody tangles. Entire files simply ceased to exist, transformed into red mist and screaming fragments. And the charge never wavered. The Swedish cavalry hit Imperial lines like a tsunami of flesh and steel. They didn't just break through, they annihilated entire formations. Imperial pikemen, who should have been able to form hedgehog defenses against cavalry, were simply trampled into the mud. Horses impaled themselves on pikes and kept advancing, driving the weapons through their own bodies to get at the men holding them. But here's the fourth incident, the one that even Swedish sources acknowledge. DGE with horror. The cavalry couldn't stop. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button. What we're uncovering here isn't just military history. It's evidence of something that armies tried to hide for centuries. Share this with someone who loves dark mysteries. The discovery phase of our investigation gets even more disturbing. Let's discover what happens next. King Gustavus Adolphus died sometime between 1:30 and 2 p.m. on November 16, 1632. The exact circumstances of his death remain disputed, but what is certain is that he was thrown from his horse strafe after the animal took multiple wounds. The king, partially blinded by a musket ball that grazed his head and nearsighted even before injury, became separated from his guard in the fog and chaos. Imperial cavalry found him and shot him multiple times at close range. But it was the recovery of his body that revealed the full horror of what had been unleashed at Lützen. Jakub Stalhanska, younger brother of the Swedish commander Torsten Stalhanska, led a party of Finnish cavalrymen to retrieve the king's corpse around 5 p.m. as fighting was dying down. His official report was brief and clinical, noting the recovery of the king's body from among the fallen, but his private letters discovered in 1923 in a Finnish archive tell a very different story. We found His Majesty stripped naked by looters, face down in freezing mud. This indignity I expected. What I did not expect was the field itself. Brother, I have seen many battlefields. This was different. The horses, oh God in heaven, the horses. They lay in heaps where artillery had struck them, bodies torn and broken. But they had fallen facing forward, every single one. Horses that had been disemboweled, still trying to crawl toward enemy lines with their entrails dragging. Horses with shattered legs that had crawled on their knees. And their eyes, the eyes were the worst. Milky white, pupils rolled back in their heads, but the eyelids still open, still fixed forward. I found strafe 30 paces beyond where the king fell, 11 musket balls in his body. His chest cavity was open. I could see his heart, still faintly beating though the beast was clearly dead. How long had he carried the king while dying? How far? And he was not alone. I counted 40 Swedish cavalry mounts in a space smaller than a peasant's field. Some had been burned by artillery. Others had been hacked apart by swords and axes. One had been disemboweled by a pike, its intestines spread across 10 feet of mud, and yet it had pushed forward until its heart gave out. None of them had tried to flee. Not one. When we gathered the king's body, my men found something else. In His Majesty's saddlebags, which Strife still carried, we discovered bottles. Dark glass bottles sealed with wax, containing a liquid that smelled of death and forest rot. And a document, water damaged, but still partially legible. It was written in a language I did not recognize. Perhaps Finnish, perhaps something older. But there were drawings, horses with spirals drawn on their flanks, runes from the old pagan times. And at the bottom, in the king's own hand in Swedish, "May God forgive the necessity." I burned it. I burned all of it right there in the mud, and I swore my men to silence on their immortal souls. But Stalhanski's wasn't the only testimony. Over the following weeks, as the Swedish army retreated from Lützen, technically the battle was a Swedish victory, as they held the field, but without Gustavus they had lost their cause. More evidence emerged. Field surgeon Dr. Erik Dahlberg was assigned to care for wounded cavalry horses, those few that survived. His medical notes, preserved in the Karolinska Institute archives. I have examined 43 cavalry mounts recovered from Lützen. Of these, 37 displayed symptoms consistent with massive overdose of stimulant substances. Pupils fixed and dilated. Heart rates elevated even unto death. 12 of the animals survived 3 days or more after battle with wounds that should have killed them within hours. 4 lived for more than a week, refusing all food and water, standing at attention until their bodies simply failed. I performed necropsy on 17 animals. All showed massive liver damage consistent with toxic exposure. Several had stomach contents that, when analyzed, proved to contain alcohol, fungal matter, and something else, a plant material I cannot identify, dark and fibrous, with an odor that caused 2 of my assistants to become violently ill. Most disturbing, brain examinations revealed significant abnormalities in all specimens. The amygdala, the portion of the brain governing fear response, appeared almost crystallized in structure, as though frozen or chemically altered. I lack the anatomical knowledge to fully explain what I observed, but I am convinced these animals had been rendered incapable of fear through artificial means. I have reported these findings to Colonel Stalhanska. He has instructed me to cease all investigation and to destroy my notes. I am copying these records in secret and entrusting them to my brother in Stockholm. Let God judge whether what was done at Lützen was justified by victory. The physical evidence from Lützen told its own story. When spring came and the snow melted in 1633, farmers returning to their fields made disturbing discoveries. The Swedish cavalry charge had carved a path exactly 380 yards long and 200 yards wide through Imperial positions, a corridor of total devastation marked by thousands of hoofprints, driven so deep into the earth that they remained visible for months. But within that corridor, something was wrong with the soil. A Swedish geologist visiting the battlefield in 1634 noted in his journal that plants growing in the cavalry's path were sickly and strange-colored, with leaves that curled in upon themselves. Local farmers refused to work those fields for 3 years, claiming the earth itself had been poisoned. The horses' bones told their own story. In 1887, when a railway was being constructed through the Lützen battlefield, workers unearthed a mass grave containing the remains of hundreds of horses. A German archaeologist, Dr. Wilhelm Mengershausen, conducted analysis of the skeletal remains. His report noted extreme bone density inconsistent with normal equine physiology and stress fractures throughout the skeletal structure, suggesting the animals were running at speeds beyond safe biological limits. Most tellingly, chemical analysis of bone marrow, cutting-edge science in 1887, revealed heavy metal concentrations and alkaloid residues consistent with sustained exposure to toxic substances. What authorities discovered next would be carefully buried in Swedish military archives for nearly 3 centuries. The official history of Gustavus Adolphus's death would become legend, the great king killed heroically in battle, his loyal horse carrying him forward even unto death. Artists would paint it, poets would memorialize it. It would become foundational mythology for Swedish national identity. But the truth was, Gustavus Adolphus and his commanders had poisoned 1,632 horses to create an unstoppable weapon. They had taken animals and chemically removed their capacity for fear, for self-preservation, for everything that makes a creature rational. They had created biological machines whose only function was to charge forward until death claimed them. And the king had died beneath one of these creatures, killed by the very system he'd ordered into existence. The Swedish military conducted 2 investigations into the events at Lützen. The first, in December 1632, was purely for public consumption. It established the official narrative. King Gustavus Adolphus had died heroically in combat, betrayed by the fog and by inferior officers who failed to protect him. Field Marshal Horn was blamed for tactical decisions. The Imperial forces were portrayed as having fought dishonorably. Nothing was said about the cavalry horses. The second investigation, beginning in March 1633, was very different. Queen Christina, Gustavus's 6-year-old daughter and heir, was now nominally Sweden's ruler, with a regency council actually governing. That council included Chancellor Axel Oxenstierna, Field Marshal Lennart Torstensson, and several others who had been intimately involved in Swedish military planning. These were practical men who understood that Sweden's survival depended on military effectiveness. They needed to know what had happened at Lützen and whether it could be repeated. The investigation was classified at the highest level. Even the existence of the inquiry wasn't officially acknowledged. But documents discovered in the Swedish Royal Archives in 1976, during a routine cataloging project, revealed its scope and conclusions. Colonel Torsten Stalhansky was the first witness called. His testimony, given under oath with his hand on a Bible, was clinical and damning. The cavalry preparation was developed beginning in 1628, after His Majesty witnessed Swedish horses breaking under artillery fire at Stralsund. He became convinced that if we could eliminate fear in our mounts, we could achieve tactical advantages that no other army possessed. We consulted with experts. University physicians told us it was impossible, so we looked elsewhere. To the Sami people of the north, who have for centuries used substances to alter consciousness in their shamanic practices. To folk healers who claimed knowledge of herbs that could make men fearless. Even to certain Catholic monks who had studied alchemy and the humoral sciences. What we eventually developed was a compound of several elements. Aquavit alcohol to serve as solvent and initial calming agent. Extracts from Amanita muscaria mushrooms, which the Lapps use for visions. Belladonna, which dilates pupils and causes euphoria. Henbane, which deadens pain and produces dissociative states. And one other element, the identity of which I was sworn never to reveal. The preparation required careful dosing. Too little, and the horses would retain enough fear to break under fire. Too much, and they would become uncontrollable or die before battle began. We tested extensively on captured horses, on animals purchased specifically for trials. The mortality rate in testing was approximately 30%. His Majesty was troubled by the ethical dimensions. Pastor Mathieu argued that we were perverting God's creation, making beasts into something against nature. But His Majesty believed the Protestant cause justified extraordinary measures. If we lose, he told me, Catholics will burn our churches and hang our pastors. We fight for survival. In such circumstances, is anything forbidden? The investigation examined supply records, which revealed the scale of the operation. Between 1629 and 1632, Swedish military procurement included 1847 gallons of aquavit, far exceeding any amount for human consumption, 327 pounds of dried mushrooms, 156 pounds of various plant materials, including belladonna and henbane, payments to 7 different Sami guides, and herb specialists, contracts with 3 separate alchemists, one based in Prague, one in Leipzig, one in Stockholm. The total cost was staggering, approximately 47,000 riksdaler, roughly equivalent to the annual salary of 2,000 soldiers. Sweden had invested the equivalent of maintaining an entire regiment for a year into developing a chemical compound to modify horse behavior. But what about the horses themselves? What happened to those that survived Lützen? Dr. Eric Dahlberg's supplementary report to the investigation revealed the aftermath. Of the roughly 3,000 Swedish cavalry horses that participated in the battle, approximately 1,100 were killed outright. Another 300 died from wounds within a week. Of the 1,600 survivors, nearly 600 had to be destroyed within a month due to injuries or behavioral problems. The behavioral problems were most disturbing. Horses that had been given the battle preparation but survived the fight often became impossible to manage. They were aggressive toward handlers, refused to eat, and displayed what modern veterinary science would recognize as symptoms of severe neurological damage. Many had seizures, some became catatonic, standing motionless until they collapsed from exhaustion. Swedish cavalry effectiveness plummeted after Lützen. The secret preparation had worked, once, but it had consumed the cavalry as an effective force. Replacements took months to train and condition, and knowledge of what had been done was spreading. By mid-1633, Imperial forces were circulating propaganda describing Swedish demon horses and claiming the Swedes had made pacts with Satan for military advantage. Worse, the ethical consequences were beginning to dawn on those involved. Pastor Johannes Mathieu, the army chaplain, suffered what appears to have been a complete mental breakdown in April 1633. His writings from this period, preserved in Uppsala Cathedral archives, show a man tortured by guilt. I blessed those animals before battle. I prayed over them, made the sign of the cross over their heads, asked God to preserve them in combat. But I knew, God forgive me, I knew that we had poisoned them, that we had made them into something neither fully animal nor fully weapon, but some horrible fusion of both. They could not refuse. Animals cannot sin because they cannot choose. We took that innocence and perverted it for war. We made creatures that God fashioned with the capacity for fear, a gift that preserves life, into beings that would charge into certain death without hesitation. If there is a hell, and I believe there is, we have earned our places there. The investigation's final report, submitted to the Regency Council in August 1633, made 3 recommendations. First, that the cavalry preparation be discontinued immediately and all remaining supplies destroyed. The report noted, "The tactical advantages do not outweigh the moral and practical costs. We have damaged our cavalry force perhaps beyond repair, and we have done so through means that may constitute sin against both God and nature." Second, that all documentation related to the preparation be classified at the highest level and access restricted to the Regency Council only. Knowledge of what was done must not spread. It would be used against us by Catholic propagandists and might inspire imitators. Third, and most significantly, those officers and specialists who developed and administered the preparation must never speak of it. We propose that key witnesses be assigned to distant postings, where they may serve the realm but cannot spread knowledge of these matters. Colonel Stalhansky should be sent to the Estonian border. Dr. Dahlberg should be reassigned to Uppsala. The Sami guides should be generously compensated and escorted back to their territories with instructions never to return. The council accepted all recommendations. Over the following months, everyone with direct knowledge of the cavalry preparation was quietly scattered to the 4 winds. Some, like Stalhansky, continued distinguished military careers, but never again in cavalry command. Others simply disappeared from historical records, suggesting they may have met less fortunate ends. Attempts at cover-up extended to the battlefield itself. In 1634, Swedish authorities returned to Lützen and conducted what they described as a sanctification of the ground. TTLL and sheep that refused to graze certain areas where the Swedish cavalry had charged. These were dismissed as superstition, peasant tales, the kind of folklore that accumulates around any major battlefield. But they persisted with unusual consistency across generations. Legal proceedings never occurred, not in any official sense. Sweden was in the middle of a devastating war. The Regency Council wasn't about to prosecute its own military leaders for winning a battle, even if the methods were questionable. And who would prosecute? The king who ordered it was dead. The officers who implemented it claimed they were following orders. The specialists who developed the preparation were protected by state secrecy. Instead, there was only silence. Official silence enforced by classification and distance. Personal silence enforced by guilt and horror at what had been done. Historical silence, as the true story of Lützen was buried under layers of heroic myth. The myth served its purpose. Sweden needed the legend of Gustavus Adolphus, the Protestant hero who died gloriously in battle, whose loyal horse carried him forward even in death. That myth sustained Swedish morale through the remaining 16 years of the 30 Years' War. It became part of national identity, taught to schoolchildren, immortalized in monuments and paintings. But underneath the myth, in classified archives and sealed testimonies, in the private journals of men who could never speak publicly of what they'd witnessed, the truth festered like an infected wound. The cavalry preparation at Lützen didn't change military law because it was never publicly acknowledged. But its shadow influence on military ethics and the laws of war is profound once you know to look for it. The 30 Years' War ended in 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia. Among the treaty's many provisions were some of the first attempts to codify limitations on military conduct. While these focused primarily on the treatment of civilians and prisoners, there were also curious clauses about unnatural methods of war and Christian standards of conduct, even in extremis. Swedish negotiators pushed hard for vague language in these sections. They wanted nothing that could be retroactively applied to Swedish conduct during the war. They succeeded. The language remained general enough that no one could point to specific Swedish violations. But military historians analyzing the negotiations have noted that Swedish representatives seemed almost desperate to avoid specificity about certain types of weaponry or military preparation. In the decades following the war, European military theory began to grapple with questions about the limits of military necessity. How far could armies go in pursuit of victory? Were there methods that should be forbidden, even if tactically effective? These debates, conducted in military academies and in treatises on the art of war, never explicitly mentioned Lützen or cavalry preparations. But the questions being asked suggested that something had happened, something that troubled military thinkers. The concept of poisoning of weapons or warriors appears with increasing frequency in military legal texts after 1650. The language is always about poison applied to human soldiers or weapons, never about animals. But the underlying ethical concern, that chemically altering a combatant's capacity for judgment or self-preservation represents a violation of natural law, is clearly present. Perhaps most significantly, European armies after 1650 moved sharply away from reliance on chemically enhanced performance of any kind. There's a notable absence of experimentation with substances to improve soldier or animal performance for nearly 2 centuries after Lützen. This is historically anomalous. Armies have always sought every possible advantage. The fact that this particular avenue of research was essentially abandoned suggests unspoken consensus that someone had gone too far. Similar cases, when you know what to look for, do emerge in historical records, though always obliquely. In 1702, during the Great Northern War, Russian forces reported that Swedish cavalry at the Battle of Lützen displayed unnatural courage and charged into positions where any rational cavalry would have withdrawn. Russian commanders suspected the Swedes of using war magic learned from the Finns and Lapps. Swedish authorities denied this vehemently, perhaps too vehemently. In 1757, during the 7 Years' War, Prussian cavalryman Christian von Prittwitz wrote in his memoirs about training methods he'd witnessed in Swedish military academies as an exchange officer. He described horses being exposed to preparations that made them fearless of artillery fire. He noted that Swedish officers swore these were purely training techniques, habituation through repeated exposure. But von Prittwitz expressed skepticism. "I have trained horses for 20 years. What I witnessed in Sweden was not natural learning. Those animals had been changed in some fundamental way." The British military, always keen students of continental military practice, developed elaborate regulations in the 18th century regarding stimulants and palliatives for military animals. The regulations specifically forbid any substance that might unnaturally alter the temperament or behavior of cavalry mounts. This is oddly specific. Why would you need such a regulation unless someone, somewhere, had done exactly that? The practice of veterinary medicine as a formal discipline emerged in the 18th century partly in response to military needs. Early veterinary texts contained curious warnings about various plant substances and their effects on horses. Belladonna, henbane, various fungi. All are described not just in terms of their poisonous effects but specifically in terms of their potential to alter natural behavior or eliminate appropriate caution. Why such specificity unless veterinarians were guarding against specific past abuses? The lasting impact on military communities, particularly Swedish military culture, is harder to trace but may be more profound. After Lützen, Swedish cavalry never again achieved the same reputation for reckless courage. Swedish military culture became notably more conservative, more focused on discipline and training, rather than on achieving psychological or pharmacological edges. This could be random historical evolution, or it could represent institutional trauma, a military establishment that had glimpsed the abyss and stepped back. Swedish military archives contain a curious gap. Documents related to cavalry operations between 1625 and 1635 are far less complete than records from before or after that period. This could be ordinary loss. Archives are incomplete. But the pattern suggests deliberate culling. Someone went through and removed documents, likely in the late 17th or early 18th century, likely to bury evidence of practices that had become embarrassing. The Lützen battlefield itself remained a site of unease for generations. Local Germans avoided it at night. German military units passing through the area would make detours to avoid camping on the field. This continued well into the 19th century, long past the point where any direct memory of the battle should have persisted. When Swedish and German veterans organizations erected monuments at Lützen in the 19th and 20th centuries, the inscriptions focused entirely on human sacrifice and courage. Not one mentions the horses. Given that cavalry was the decisive arm at Lützen, this absence is striking. It's as if there was unspoken agreement not to look too closely at that particular aspect of the battle. What does Lützen reveal about human nature and the nature of war? First, that the logic of military necessity is a bottomless pit. Once you accept that winning justifies extraordinary means, there's no natural stopping point. Gustavus Adolphus was a devout Christian, a man troubled by the ethical implications of what he was doing. But he did it anyway because he believed his cause was just and his need was desperate. The road to atrocity is paved with similar reasoning. Second, that we are capable of elaborate self-deception about the costs of our methods. The Swedish military convinced itself that chemically lobotomizing horses' fear responses was acceptable because it was just animals and the cause was righteous. They didn't think about the suffering of creatures rendered unable to flee from agony. They didn't think about the violation of natural limits. They thought only about tactical advantage. Third, that societies will enthusiastically embrace myths that absolve them of uncomfortable truths. Sweden needed the legend of Gustavus Adolphus, so Sweden got that legend and carefully buried everything that contradicted it. The truth was too ugly, too complicated, too damaging to national pride. So the truth was classified, scattered, and buried. Fourth, that animals pay the price for human wars in ways we rarely acknowledge. Historians count human casualties at Lützen, approximately 6,000 dead. They rarely count the 1632 Swedish cavalry horses that were chemically altered and sent to die, or the uncounted hundreds of other horses killed in the battle. Animals are invisible victims in our historical narratives, but their suffering is no less real. Finally, that some knowledge probably should be suppressed. The Regency Council that investigated Lützen reached a stark conclusion. The cavalry preparation worked, but it should never be used again. Knowledge of how to do it should be buried. This runs counter to our modern assumption that knowledge is always good, that everything should be researched and recorded. But some capabilities, once proven possible, become temptations that future generations may not resist. Perhaps the Swedish Regency Council was right to bury what they learned. The Swedish cavalry preparation at Lützen represents a historical moment when human ingenuity and military necessity pushed past ethical boundaries into territory that still disturbs us nearly 4 centuries later. It's a reminder that technological and pharmacological capabilities can advance faster than our wisdom about when to use them. And it's a reminder that in war, the boundary between victory and atrocity can be terrifyingly thin. What do you think drove Gustavus Adolphus to authorize something as extreme as the cavalry preparation? Was it justified by the desperate stakes of the 30 Years' War, or did the Swedish military cross a line that should never be crossed? Leave your theories in the comments below. The documents we've uncovered about Lützen raise profound questions about how far armies will go in pursuit of victory, and what we're willing to do to creatures that can't consent or refuse. It's a dark chapter that official history's buried for good reason, but buried truths have a way of revealing patterns that repeat across history. If you found this investigation compelling, subscribe to Fierce Sermon for more lost chapters of military history that they don't teach in school. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the shadows where official history fears to look. What other dark military secrets do you think are buried in classified archives? Let us know what you want us to investigate next. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.